Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our fourth week OUSSG event. Our guest tonight is Professor Geoff Dabelko. Professor Dabelko is Professor and Associate Dean at the Voinovich School of Leadership and Public Affairs at Ohio University and Senior Advisor at the Wilson Center's Environmental Change and Security Program. Professor Dabelko was also a lead author on the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's Fifth Assessment and serves on the UN Environment Programme's Expert Advisory Group on Environment, Conflict and Peacebuilding. Tonight, Professor Dabelko will be speaking on the topic of security. What's climate change got to do with it? Thank you so much for your time and for speaking to us tonight.
Well, terrific. Thank you so much for the invitation. It's really my pleasure and look forward to engagement. It's a big topic. It's one that certainly is getting a lot more attention right now. And so I look forward to the conversation. Folks should feel free to jump right in. So with that kind of rhetorical question of sorts, security, what's climate change got to do with it? I hope to give you multiple ways that it has been put together. It's changed over time. Lots of different centers of activity, certainly contested and debated, but we'll have a chance to run across those different ideas, and then we can dig down where you might like to focus. So word of context, always really important to know kind of the perspective of the speaker. Instrumental for me was 20-some years in Washington, D.C., much of it at this Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. It sits between scholarship and policy. It's actually formally part of the government, like a memorial is. It's a formal memorial to Wilson. So it's nonpartisan, non-advocacy, and gave us a forum to bring together, starting in the early 90s, the worlds of environment and then climate change, natural resources, health, development, with foreign and security policy actors. So folks that weren't necessarily used to talking with one another. And so as a director of the Environmental Change and Security Program there, it was my job to facilitate these conversations and try to understand the different research to policy and then policy within policy to policy from these different portfolios. As was also mentioned, I have the honor and the scars of having served on the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. It was the first time that the security questions got its own chapter, maybe the last time, because the next one doesn't have a devoted chapter. It was framed as human security, cast a wide net that included traditional dimensions of security considerations, issues of war and peace, but also a wider lens that looked at livelihoods and migration and health and this kind of broader security agenda that is part of the discussion that encompasses the traditional but goes beyond it. And so in that sense, with the IPCC being essentially the largest book reviewing the literature, had a sense of kind of what we know and understanding how that from the climate science side has informed the discussions that we're having today. So what are the discussions we're having today? Well, it requires that we first, and kind of to enter this discussion as we abandon some of the stereotypes. A big part of the hurdle to starting this is for these very different worlds to understand that there's some caricatures and assumptions of each other. On the environment side, the climate side, the notion that it's a kind of the do-gooder tree huggers that are part of this discussion. Equally, on the flip side, those coming from the climate or environment side, assuming that the security is just a matter of blowing things up, right? And we know that there's quite a bit more to it. But having spoken to audiences across the spectrum of geography and topic, can't stress enough how this is a critical first step to having an engaged discussion, to kind of knowing that the shorthand for these two different fields are quite often different in terms of the assumptions of what are the issues, who's involved, what are the tools that are brought to the table, what are the threats, what are the responses. So very quick notion of historical context. Most of this discussion really took off with the end of the Cold War, so 1989 to 91, 92. And then it was largely focused on the first bullet point there, environmental scarcity and abundance. Does environmental change contribute to organized violence? There are lots of different ways that environment and security, as it was framed then and still now, come together. That's about violence. That's about a wider fragility, stability perspective. Certainly it's other kind of connected things, but still quite different topics, like how much does war damage the environment? How does the environment impact security institutions and how they operate and where they operate? The kind of glass half full version of, can we use shared dependence on resources to try to build trust, confidence, and ultimately peace? So the environmental peacebuilding work came a little later, late 90s, early 2000s. Human security, which is that in many ways, response to the end of the Cold War. They weren't new issues, but they were new issues that could be discussed within a security context after the bipolar US-Soviet competition in the Cold War had come to an end, more inclusive of these questions of livelihoods. And then it's important to add that on the ecosystem security side, if we have a truly interdisciplinary discussion, it's possible that folks across the table are actually thinking about not securing the state, but in fact securing the ecosystem itself, right? So some really different definitions. The climate insecurity discussion that we're going to focus on today actually was not featured prominently at all in that early 90s, early 2000s stage. It was seen as long-term, diffuse, unintentional, and not the kind of immediacy that, there was real immediacy in the mid-90s civil wars in West Africa and Rwanda and Haiti and Somalia and such, the kind of cases that drew a lot of attention to natural resource scarcity and violence in particular, where this topic was focused. But it wasn't until 2005, 6, and 7 when some prominent reports, when time this topic was discussed at the UN Security Council, came to attention that climate change was a prominent part of the discussion. I would say, kind of in some ways jumping to some of the bottom line ends, it's now the discussion, which is both a sign of progress, also a sign of a challenge that other issues can get, that are also important in this context, can get pushed to the side. So it's hard to get traction for other broader environment, natural resource dimensions within various security considerations, in part because the climate change discussion and who's empowered and who's focusing on that issue really kind of dominates the discussion. This may be a particularly US context, but I don't know if anyone wasted their money some years ago on this film. Kind of the world freezes overnight, people somehow walk 50 miles overnight, and it's kind of a waste of time in the kind of catastrophism of the climate, what climate change is going to mean for society. So kind of on the one side, it's an extreme. The other, Michael Crichton has this conspiracy about how the evil greenies are going to make California fall into the ocean, and it's kind of on the opposite side. Part of the challenge of this is understanding that some of these extreme versions of what climate change is or will mean are not helpful. There's plenty of science and plenty to focus on in the middle, and so we kind of cut off the tails of the perspectives. And again, just comes from having engaged with folks that they can find themselves out on these margins, and at least sometimes in the US context, it's not particularly helpful. This next couple slides gives a lot of my climate scientist friends heartburn, but it's meant to be illustrative of observed current and anticipated dimensions of climate change, direct impacts. Well, what is it when we say climate change? What is this going to mean? What's it going to translate into? Lots of diversity by geography and time and intensity and frequency of some of these dynamics. But it gives one a sense that there's some really big systemic changes. So in that distinction between weather and climate, it's not just what it's going to be tomorrow, but it's a longer term trend that is posing in a variety of settings, for a variety of reasons, real challenges. Certainly knock-on effects of kind of what does it mean for humans and society and how we adapt or maladapt to these changes. We move, has dramatic impact on economic activity and livelihoods, on food production, on kind of underappreciated areas in terms of what it means for marine ecosystems, coastal ecosystems, when one starts looking at the economic impacts of those declining marine systems, as well as how critical those fish are for sources of protein in certain parts of the world. And it starts to really aggregate up to larger sets of challenges. And then some geopolitical dimensions that are often illustrated with new transportation routes in some ways. Some folks working on this from the U.S. Navy perspective talk about what does it mean that we have another sea, entirely new sea that's opened up in terms of what it means from a strategic perspective for security actors, foreign policy actors. There are these kinds of ways that a more serious attempt to more precisely categorize what are the threats, where are they, the degree of confidence that we have in the science in terms of the trends. This isn't meant to be one that we get into in detail, but it's to indicate that there are ways somewhere between a totally indecipherable scientific paper and the kind of bullet points that I had previous, that there are ways to try to understand what these changes will mean where, and a degree of change and our confidence in the science behind it. If we start to try to turn it into, okay, so what is this? Why does this matter to security? How does this connect? This is a figure that was developed from a G7 group of 7 foreign ministers' request to understand how climate change would fit into a range of concerns, not kind of as a standalone as that global pressures increasing suggests, but in the context of these big trends, some of which are environmental, some of which are kind of mobility around urbanization, equity with the unequal economic development, equality, population growth and such. The climate change is part of those big trends and can impact these different areas that start to become areas of focus to then see what the changes are, what the human responses are, and when and how those affect the stability of countries and regions, and what the response of security actors may be. So I mentioned in 2007, this got a lot more attention. Did for a variety of reasons. One, the science has consistently, for now at least 20 years, moved faster. So the problems have been worse and more dramatic than assumed by the scientific assessments. And so it's one that there's been a sense of additional urgency, limited time for responding before catastrophic climate impacts in a variety of areas. So the science, certainly a prominence of disasters that have differential impacts in Europe, for example, whether it's heat waves in France or some of the flooding that multiple countries experienced, has had to some degree an effect of bringing climate change into the political realm in ways that moved away from kind of, well, in the US case, bifurcation by party in terms of the perspective. Hurricane Katrina or Sandy in this country did not have a similar kind of rally around the flag effect that made it an issue that brought greater consensus. But in some parts of the world, those were disasters were critical in getting the political will to take these issues more seriously and put resources against them. The foreign and security policy communities that I must say don't have the luxury of the ebbs and flows of politics in many respects, if their jobs are to assess threats and prepare for even low or unknown probability but high negative outcomes, started to do and found issues that mattered from a variety of ways, and we can talk about that. And so those statements started to hold some sway. As I said, in 2007, for the first time, with the UK putting the issue on the table, the UN Security Council had its first devoted session to an environmental issue, was climate change. The Germans have done it subsequently, and there have been here in the last couple of years a number of them with not permanent members, but some of the rotating members bringing it forward. That will continue, I believe. Ireland's upcoming time on the Security Council, they've signaled that this is going to be an issue that they're putting forward. So that forum has been one that is increasingly seen as appropriate. At the same time, there continue to be really important actors, including P5 members, Russia and China, that indicate that yes, climate change is an issue with some differing takes on importance, but that it's a social and environmental economic issue and is not appropriate under security. So it's by no means a consensus that that's the right forum, but the sessions continue to move forward with some institutional, cross-UN institutional building to tackle this from a security perspective. Kind of on the opposite end, the General Assembly, I should say, one critical voice is often underappreciated, I think, is the kind of moral and legitimacy perspective from small island states, prominent in the General Assembly, where the counter to this is not a security issue is the sense that we're literally facing an existential threat to the existence of our territory, of our countries, from the impacts of climate change. So how can this not be a security threat? So don't want to discount that continued voice in bringing these issues forward. Environmental advocates, and that's a kind of a good and a bad and an ugly story in some ways. We can talk about that if you'd like. But certainly it's been one that has become more prominent in advocacy efforts. And then it has really mattered national leaders taking this on, and that's changed over time, of course. And we'll see how there's a big change in the United States here just recently and what that means. So kind of from those broad to some of the specific, so this is the National Intelligence Council, is the body of the U.S. intelligence community that does assessments. And here kind of flags in one of their early assessments of this issue and puts it into context that it is not a unique problem in and of itself, but it's exacerbating existing underlying problems that are threatening state stability. So the kind of integration rather than standalone dimension of climate change within a security context. Some examples of where this kind of plays out. So Pakistan, when folks here in the US were going to do a national security assessment of climate change from our National Academy of Sciences, they spent a lot of time focusing on Pakistan, part because they're important dynamics, it's an important country, but for security actors, it's an unequivocally important story for where it sits in the history of conflict in the region, the presence of nuclear weapons, the stability or instability within the country, have severe flooding, and this was a particularly bad one. That this figure gives you a sense of just what massive levels of area were moderately and severely affected by the floods at that point. And it's like, okay, the floods, we've always had floods. I think part of what this lens brings to a security discussion is that within a traditionally defined security agenda, it's seen as a challenging case. Here's why this is even more challenging, both for the reality of what and some of this is underdeveloped water infrastructure in terms of being able to manage flooding, but it's also connected to how much livelihoods are dependent on agriculture and livestock in these areas where you have kind of total loss of those assets in some of these flooding events. But also by being downstream on many these rivers to India, the opponent, the perceived enemy, it's one that is easily manipulated by conflict entrepreneurs in terms of the Indians are flooding us or the Indians are holding back our water. And in that context, it can even be the perception of these dynamics exacerbated by climate change that can be part of the strategic tensions in the region in a really meaningful bilateral, multilateral relationship. So in that sense, in terms of getting security actors' attention for understanding the complexity of the challenges, Pakistan is one that is often a focus. More diffuse and very diverse are the questions around what if, for time immemorial, we've had kind of herders versus farmers in conflict over time. I think it's about rate of change and the inability of our conflict resolution mechanisms to evolve in a timely fashion that is of great concern in places like the Horn of Africa. And these are images from Sudan and a UN Environment Report looking at these issues in specific. Certainly the questions of sea level rise and what it means for people and moving, although important to note that actually the greatest mortality in some of these, at least extreme weather events, comes from those who don't have the ability to move. The disappearing water towers, again, it seems silly, but if one thinks of glaciers and seasonal snowmelt that are declining under climate change as the water towers for some of these communities, and by communities, it's not just a few thousand people, hundreds of thousands of people, millions of people, that this is a fundamental change that means that in some ways, looking to the past to predict and understand the future is not necessarily as accurate and useful as it has been in the past. In that context, too, transboundary water competition has been competition, a lot of saber rattling, despite the kind of favor that the water wars rhetoric is given. However, this too is one where we increasingly are concerned that the future won't look like the past in terms of states not going engaging in conflict. That's one that really interesting research and makes it hard, but back to kind of some of the utility of bringing some of the security perspectives, that comfort level with risk analysis and probabilities and hedging against risk that's so familiar in the security community is one that I think folks working in the climate space would really benefit from. Migration scenarios get a lot of attention there in Europe, obviously. This is the kind of the Bangladesh, because it's so low-lying and there's so many people vulnerable to flooding and sea level rise. Extreme events gets a lot of attention. It is a highly militarized border with India at times, with kind of terms of engagement as shoot on sight for immigration. So really politicized and deadly. I should say it's by no means those kinds of almost cliche at some point migration scenarios, the sea level rise holding a kind of a different security threat. This is a figure that the Department of Transportation prepared for the Obama administration, Department of Homeland Security, to start to understand vulnerabilities to infrastructure in the US homeland to climate change. And essentially railroad tracks and road infrastructure that's heavily integrated with receiving, processing, and moving out petroleum, as well as quite a few people living there. That these are issues that are not just quote unquote over there or for developing countries or poor countries. It is very much so an issue, although manifesting in different fashion. It's a different kind of vulnerability with so much infrastructure built up on our also vulnerable coasts. The Arctic, of course, the Arctic gets a lot of attention, especially recently, although one might say we're only beginning to start to understand what the notion of a new sea means. In this context, it's opening up potentially entirely new areas for access for resources, so a race for resources among countries, among private sector actors. Certainly from this kind of geopolitical and geoeconomic perspective, a huge transport benefit, largely to move fossil fuels from Russia to Asia, much shorter, much cheaper, much more realistic. Some maritime boundary disputes, although I don't think the institutions are up to that. lot for security actors of a notion that they're just going to be a greater burden. And so having seen, for example, some of these discussions within the Department of Homeland Security in the US, which houses our Coast Guard, where it's why are we at this meeting on climate change, to coming out and understanding that the assets that they possess are in no way up to the task of kind of multiple crises at the same time. And so the Deepwater Horizon scenario, where we had in the Gulf a deep underwater oil spill, starting to conceive of what the search and rescue and responsibilities would be. The security institutions are only capable institutions to operate in some of those environments, and so it's daunting. Also include a picture of one of the Chinese nuclear icebreakers, where the Chinese and the Russians are far ahead of us in terms of capacity of those, where we've kind of just pretended that we don't need them until here recently in the US. So this can, in some contexts for security communities, really be about how this dynamic of climate change may impact how they operate. So this is an area of the United States and Virginia, the Hampton Roads area, that's, I think, our largest naval base, maybe along with San Diego. Also an Air Force base, or naval air base, and giving some scenarios for just massive displacement of a huge amount of infrastructure. And so the disruptive notion, and so whether it's flying missions off from Diego Garcia in the Indian Ocean, or what it means for bases here at home, starts to be an or the kind of new procurement requirements and capacity requirements for operating in the Arctic. It really is a fundamental change that requires greater attention. Finally, less prominent in these discussions until just recently, although still kind of emerging, a topic in some sense that says, we spent a lot of time trying to understand what those direct climate impacts are and our immediate responses might be, and how those factor into security discussions. An additional realm is, as we are starting to get serious about responding to climate change, making a green energy transition, how is that what is going to be dramatic changes in terms of how we live, where we live, how we move, our basis of our economy? How do our responses to climate change hold the prospect of contributing to conflict or undercutting stability? So, if it's done poorly, it might create new conflicts or exacerbate existing ones.
Professor Dabelko faced some technical difficulties. After resuming, we start again on the same slide.
Well, the short version of this is the question of what kind of conflict potential comes from these big changes, right? If these are all different ways that we're moving to a greener, non-fossil fuel-based economy, you can imagine a variety of challenges that can play into existing or create new conflicts. The Petro states are not going to go quietly, and one could already analyze some of the adventurism in really negative terms of whether it's Saudi or Russia already, that it would be a needed transition, but there are going to be losers, and these losers aren't going to take it sitting down. The list of minerals that go into renewable technologies are very similar to the old list. And so the question is, will those create some of the same dysfunctions around governance that we see with petro states? The kind of jury's out, but a lot more work on that going on right now. Geoengineering is this kind of exceptional technological intervention at the global scale in our atmosphere in particular, but also our oceans. In many ways seen as kind of giving up on the prospect for making a transition away from fossil fuels fast enough. And so instead try to reflect sunlight out, kind of akin to as if you had a volcanic explosion and put a lot of particulates in the upper atmosphere, or you put iron oxide in the oceans to have them absorb more carbon. Why is this part of the discussion? Well, some would like the military to deploy these technologies. Others would like the military to stop people from deploying the technologies. But either way, it's at a scale that prospectively could fundamentally affect economies and livelihoods and be deployed in ways with very little kind of consultation, because there's very little international law or even norms behind it. So part of an agenda that's not, I think, fully yet appreciated for the security community, but one that's coming. So to start to wrap up, so this is kind of how 10 years ago, the Defense Department saw these issues of kind of playing into existing conflicts, making tough problems harder. And then fast forward to kind of conclude with some of what's going on at present. This is our new Secretary of Defense. So new that there isn't really a good civilian headshot of him. It's all from when he was a general not too long ago, which is another issue. But nevertheless, indicating that climate change was going to be something within the Defense Department that's seen as a risk for risk analysis, that they can bring some of their simulation modeling, wargaming analysis tools to bear on it, as well as being such a big purchaser and user of energy and lots of infrastructure platforms, one that could help move to more climate-friendly technologies at scale. Why is he saying it, or in the context that he's saying it, is what is quite specific and quite extensive from the new Biden administration is a executive order that's a couple weeks old. Apologies for all the text, but here is the actual text of some of the relevant sections. A number of instances where ordering different parts of the government to prepare reports in 90 days or 120 days for understanding what climate change means for security. So that's kind of Secretary Kerry and the new presidential envoy for climate. That's the Intelligence Council. That's the Department of Defense in collaboration with a whole host of civilian agencies and departments for a climate risk analysis to kind of develop this as a tool to cross all our questions of foreign security policy, including roles for Homeland Security. The Arctic is privileged there, again, because of that Coast Guard role. Also, Homeland Security has our immigration offices, and so a separate executive order on understanding climate change and migration linkages. And then that section 104 at the bottom is reinstating the last year of the Obama administration, a memorandum that through a security lens requires all parts of the US government to integrate and take action on particularly the mitigation side of climate change. UN Security Council, I mentioned this earlier, so I won't revisit it. It still is highly contentious because of a couple notable P5 countries pushing back on whether it's a security issue. But with the kind of continued string of countries wanting and succeeding in putting it on the agenda there, it will be a forum that brings attention to the issue. It remains to be seen what the action items that flow from it will be. EU, a variety of areas that are not too different in terms of kind of larger analytical statements, and it, for the most part, there's some EU level investment in doing things, so to speak. A lot of it is by individual member states, but there's kind of some degree of comparable presence. One spin-off between kind of in some ways the EU, with the Germans and the Dutch contributing quite a bit to a process looking outside the Union, outside of Europe, to places that are perceived to be big challenges for those in the Lake Chad region, but also for what it means in terms of migration to Europe. Really a quite nuanced understanding of the issues there, and putting in context some of the really strong challenges around the Islamic State and Boko Haram, without kind of devolving into bumper stickers and overly simplistic understandings of the dynamics there. So I can recommend Adelphi research out of Berlin, the work that they're leading up. So this is a good metaphor for our audio problems, like so many ways that this can be seen. I put it here in part because getting out of our silos is part of what we need to do, whether that's at a climate and security silo, whether that's an interdisciplinary understanding. But it really does require us to move away from what we typically see as success to having a broader notion and go back to peaceful thinking scenes here, pastoral scenes from southeastern Ohio, where apparently broadband continues to be a problem, but we knew that already. So thanks so much. I hope you're still there.
We are. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for a really interesting and informative talk. And I'm really sorry about the technical issues and that you had to repeat some of it.
Oh, it's no problem for me, but it'd be torture for you guys, so I'm sorry.
No, it happens. Do you still have time for a Q&A?
Sure,
Okay?
no problem, of course, yeah.
Okay, perfect.
That's about all we got at this point, so that's really fine.
Thank you so much. So we're going to open up the floor to questions then. So if you'd like to ask a question, please use the raise hand function or just type into the chat. And I'll read your question out in that case. I can see we already have a question from William Evans. So William, would you like to go?
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Sure thing. Thank you.
Thanks for that talk. Really interesting. And in spite of the technical problems, I suppose all this is dependent on international cooperation. And of course, the UK will be hosting the Glasgow Climate Change Conference later this year.
Mm-hmm.
How does this work in the context with a sort of sharp American-Chinese bilateral relationship, which is likely to continue? It's going to be a difficult relationship even under the new president. How are we going to get genuine cooperation from those the two largest economies to make progress on this subject?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting. Secretary Kerry, in his presidential envoy roles, already in some ways revised his position, which initially was that climate change in the U.S.-China relationship was going to be standalone and not connected to some of those other areas where the relationship is dicier, as you say. And so he's seeing it as kind of walk that back a bit. I do think that's a fundamental challenge. I think there are a couple of there's a broader answer that's a climate change answer, and not necessarily a security one. And the broader answer is that we need to remember that it is sometimes the national capitals and the federal or national policy that leads, and sometimes it follows. And in this space, the role of the private sector, of regional organizations, subnational organizations, that are playing very big roles in making a difference. It's hard to aggregate it. It's hard to get a sense of it and coordinate it. But nevertheless, and maybe this is just kind of reflecting our adaptation strategy within the United States when we were totally bereft of leadership from Washington for the previous 4 years. But I do think that's part of the answer. I think there is possibility in terms of cooperation on this issue, even when the other set of trade and kind of geopolitical competition is more dicey, in part because of the fact that the negative impacts are impacting all, and it's not a challenge that can be kind of targeted or controlled to benefit one to the disadvantage of the other. I think there'll be a tremendous amount of economic competitive in the green technology space, right? So that could lead to, prospectively kind of one-upmanship, which is part of what was starting to happen at the end of the Obama administration with China, that there was kind of a positive escalation of steps being taken to try to assert leadership, in part, I think, particularly from the Chinese perspective, to sell more green technologies and be able to develop it. But yeah, no, I think it is a critical question, one that won't be easy, but in some ways it wasn't going to be easy anyway, yeah, I don't know. It's the right question to ask. I wish I had a better answer.
Thank you very much. So we have another question that was sent in from our YouTube audience, which reads, how do you foresee great power competition, potentially militarily, over Arctic resources or trade routes playing out as the new thaw occurs, especially Russia, China, and US?
Yeah. So that's one where the sense has been until quite recently that, and I think this is probably still the case, it's just such an inhospitable environment. It's just not very efficient to butt heads there, right? It's really hard. I think the more likely challenges will come in kind of potential disasters. So Russian movement of fossil fuels to the Asian market, and then there's a disaster and who's responsible, and then it becomes quite tense because it's Canadian, American, and others party to kind of territory, land-based territory in the Arctic that are being negatively impacted by the actions of others. It is so, and so in that sense, I don't see it as a kind of a battlefield in a kind of real sense, as the battlefield itself. However, I think this will be a severe test for some of the institutions, the Arctic Council and such, which does not have China as a member, though they very much like to be. It is explicitly tried to stay out of security issues and keep it explicitly off the table. There's some reasonable arguments for why to bring the security questions explicitly into those institutions so that they can manage them rather than staying outside and then be more of a concern, as you're highlighting. The irony is that in talking to, say, the U.S. Navy admiral who was critical for task force climate change for the Navy, is he saw the Russian planting of the flag at the North Pole and such actually is quite useful because it got greater attention from his own colleagues on the one hand, and at the same time, I think it's more likely that there'll be lots of kind of saber rattling and concern, but not actually the true butting of heads in that space.
Thank you so much. Our next question will come from Sam Gibson.
Thanks for the talk, Professor. I wondered how you see the role of international law in tackling climate change, with particular reference to the sort of growing movement behind the term ecocide, sitting alongside other crimes against humanity. And just last month, Bolsonaro coming under, well, potentially being charged through the ICC for crimes against humanity and ecocide. How you see that working alongside other policies in tackling climate change? Yeah,
I think there's a ton of work to be done, and that international law is an instrument that is going to be critically important, that has really big challenges, and because it would require some big changes. But I'm hopeful that those who work in that space can be successful. One is going to be around exactly these questions that you bring up with the Brazilian case. I think in immediate context, we're already seeing lots of debate about can we distinguish what the climate contribution is to people moving and forced displacement or climate migration, or the challenge of the popular but legally anathema term of climate refugees, right? So the climate folks are not realizing their very specific definitions about what constitutes a refugee and what the obligations of receiving states are. But the conversations that are going on now about kind of organized retreat for communities that are losing literally their communities, and who pays for that, and how it's done in a just fashion, that's a space. I mentioned the geoengineering. We desperately need to set a set of norms about consultation, and that not being something done unilaterally because of the potential cross-boundary devastating effects of highly uncertain technologies. And I do think that, I do hope that the current attention being given to questions of environmental justice and the equity and historical injustices that accompany, whether it's mineral extraction for these technologies that are new and green and feel good that way, but still have really messy extraction challenges around them, or one that's common where the finger is pointed at the EU with well-intentioned climate policies for moving into biofuels to displace fossil fuels, at the same time increasing the value of biofuels on land that is then repurposed from food in developing country contexts to monocultures. That picture of the road in the forest is a monoculture palm plantation, right? Which is driven by consumption, not in Malaysia and Indonesia, but outside for food and for energy purposes. So I think there are lots of roles for international law. Feel like we're behind, but that in some ways that's exactly where we need to go.
Thank you so much. Clara, I saw you had your hand up. Do you still have a question?
Yes, I guess I can continue, because thank you for your talk, sir. And you, in a sense, started to bring up some examples, because I was really intrigued, and I thought it was a very important point you made about how our responses to climate change can also contribute to conflict. And I thought that was a very good and forward-looking way of actually managing climate change, and to see that. So apart from the example you just mentioned, could you bring up some other examples just to conceptualize how we can see this?
Yeah, so for example, if we have climate adaptation and climate mitigation, on the mitigation side, one of the commonly used tools is this REDD scheme, REDD+, reduced emissions from deforestation, forest degradation. Essentially try to put a value on forests as carbon sinks, so that they are pulling in CO2 and lessening the greenhouse effect, and doing that in a way that competes with the value of those forests as timber, largely. And doing that at scale is fantastic in principle. It requires resources, right? So the notion was put a tax on carbon, use some of the value or some of the resources to tax carbon, from a tax on carbon to pay ideally communities, often national governments, to agree to keep a forest standing and not convert it to timber or some other land use change. So that can be done well, or that can be done poorly. And we have a few examples, whether it's in Tanzania protecting a mangrove that was really important from an ecological and a carbon sink function. External money, primarily Norwegian money, external environmental NGOs working with the Tanzanian government. Unfortunately, what that meant was the Tanzanian government had top cover to move out a group of people living in that area that they've been fighting with for decades, right? So it played into a real question of who gets the benefits of those payments? How is it shared? Is it mitigating the change in natural resource access, or is it something that plays into a kind of coercing conservation, to use Nancy Peluso's term, context? And so that's one that in some ways we just have to get right, because we don't want to lose that payment for ecosystem services tool. And so to those who kind of say, when we raise this basket of backdraft issues or the conflict potential climate change, they're like, oh, I thought you thought climate change is important. Why are you making it more difficult? Well, it's so important that we not screw it up, right? Because so much of this is about changing access to resources and money. And so we have lots of analogous situations where that can be done well, it can be done poorly. It's often done inequitably. So you'll see some really strong statements, for example, from the UN Rapporteur on Indigenous People, with a lot of concern about climate mitigation adaptation schemes being yet another reason to disadvantage Indigenous peoples. And so I think those equity concerns just have to be front and center in terms of how we make this needed transition.
Thank you very much. So on the topic of inequity, we have another question in the chat from Damon Lovelace, which reads, what can the international community do about the disparity of individual countries to reduce fossil fuel usage, especially larger contributors to global pollution?
Yeah, well, I think there are a number of things. One, those that are consuming fossil fuels have a responsibility to move away from that. They often are wealthier countries, but not exclusively, right? So India is a very interesting example where, as opposed to China that has diversified and is kind of doing everything at massive scale, India, at least initially, was on the one hand, quite rightfully thinking that they were less responsible, and therefore some of the obligation of those early industrializers who historically are much bigger contributors to the problem were required to pay, whether that's technology transfer or concessional rates that would help India make that transition. But it's a challenge when energy poverty means that coal is a very attractive option. They have it and it's cheap, and they have a lot of people who are energy poor. And so it is one that really does come back to the first question about the importance of cooperation, so that there are ways that the burden of a green energy transition can be shared in I would hope, although it'd be really challenging, in a fashion that reflects that historical responsibility. And so it's not a snapshot of who are the big producers today, but we're looking at the history of the contributors to the problem.
Could I come in on the Petro question?
Yes, of course. Go ahead, Graham.
Yeah, well, looking at the sector usage of fossil fuels, how would you address a situation where aviation requires fossil fuels, even if road transport finds substitutes? Because you can't really produce kerosene without producing gasoline. So what do you do with the gasoline, basically?
Yeah, the aviation is a really interesting one. Obviously, a huge contributor in terms of fossil fuels. Interestingly, the security side here in the U.S., particularly under Obama, and I think it will probably reemerge under Biden, was one of the big investors in biofuels for aviation. In part, it was framed not just as a climate change issue, but as an energy independence issue. So the logic was we don't want to be dependent on sources for fuel outside the country for something as essential as the Air Force. And so therefore we need to invest in biofuels technologies that would allow us to. And so they have flown a number of test flights based on biofuel mixes and successfully done it. So of course the cost per gallon of that fuel is astronomical, and something that a well-funded security institution can afford, but not kind of realistic in the big in terms. I do think it's probably a different question for widespread civilian aviation. I think one solution is you just make it a lot more expensive if it continues to be fossil fuels, and we go back to it being more exceptional to do some of this flying. And maybe this will be one potential upside of us having to stay apart from one another, is that we realize that a number of things that we traveled for before we just don't have to do in the future. I know that's not a terribly satisfactory answer. I'm not satisfied with it either, but it's a kind of initial foray into thinking how we have to make change here, and it's not going to be easy, but there may be some sticks and some carrots that help us make that transition.
Thank you.
Thank you for the question.
Thank you so much. And I have a question myself, if I may.
Of course.
I was wondering, in your experience, did you find, or do you think that this link with security has brought more supporters to emphasizing the importance of climate change because they care about the security aspect of it?
Yes, but I think it's an excellent question. I think there are well, I think it may depend on where you sit in terms of the context, right? Because it's important to understand that what the security argument means is in very different contexts, right? I think it will be beneficial if it allows us to widen our notion of what constitutes security, and that we move away from a traditional realist state-based defense of territory, use of force is the primary, if not only mechanism to do it, to a wider understanding of some of these dynamics fundamentally affecting security in a broader context, right? So I think that will be helpful if it provides more space in that way on the security side. I think that secondly, in places like the United States, I'll say at least, that it is, for better or worse, often synonymous with level of importance and level of resources. And so there is some potential tactical value in doing that if one can understand, and as I think a number of important people do, but not everyone, that it is in many respects framed as these will be issues that add up to even traditional security concerns, and therefore requires not to provide more resources to the military, but it increases the imperative to get off the snide and for the civilians to act, and for us to make these transitions and make these investments in transitioning away from a fossil fuel-based economy. So General Zinni, former head of Central Command, said that we are a very blunt and expensive instrument that are brought in when all else fails. And so his message from understanding what climate change meant was that the civilians and far up the causal chain had to get a lot more serious about responding. So the problems don't end up manifesting as something where his toolbox is brought to bear. And so in that sense, there can be some value. I do think there are some real downsides, which is back in the 90s, Jyrki Kokkonen in Finland wrote a book, Greening Security or Militarizing the Environment, right? If we make competitive zero-sum conflictual relationships the way to approach this, then to the point of the very first question, we have made it harder to do the necessary cooperation to deal with the problem. I think also in some ways it's not the security community, but often some energetic environmental NGOs that feel like they've discovered a fantastic bumper sticker. And in the US political context, well, Republicans like security, so we'll say security and climate security, and then the Republicans will like our proposal and vote for what we want them to anyway. To which the Republicans say, we were born at night, but not last night. So you're not asking for anything different. So it becomes a bumper sticker and trivialized. And so that is a counterproductive way that climate security can be put together in some ways. In some cases from the security side, in some cases from the advocacy side that sees the climate imperative as particularly important. I'd add one more actually, which is it's not necessarily the security, although it kind of lends itself to us, which is the kind of climate catastrophism, the kind of undifferentiated the sign at the protests, I'm not going to die of old age, I'm going to die of climate change. That may be the case for some. It's often not some of the ones carrying the posters. And so I think part of if we scare folks, that may motivate for action, but it may not be the action you want, right? It may be withdrawal, it may be depression. It may be inaction rather than creating a kind of a proactive and innovative and cooperative response.
Thank you so much. We do have one last question if you still have time.
Sure.
Leanne, please go ahead.
Thank you so much, Professor. So regarding the actual policy making aspect, I'm wondering what your thoughts are on whether governments are doing enough to really engage with the scientists and the experts in predicting and providing solutions to these climate security or food security issues. And if they're not doing enough to engage really directly with the scientists, what can they be doing to improve this relationship?
Mm-hmm. So that's an excellent question. I think the answer is largely, well, yes and no in terms of doing enough, right? On the one hand, I think there is sufficient science and understanding, even in the face of all this uncertainty, that there's often science sufficient to inform decision-making. And in some cases, scientists are doing that and presenting that in a way, in a forum, and with enough integration of analysis to have an impact. I think the two problems, there's kind of problems on the policy side and problems on the science side. The problems on the policy side is, from their perspective, it's often not in a form that they want or require to make decisions. And so they get frustrated. And so on the one hand, they'll say, we can't act on the science because it's not kind of speaking to the questions we have or integrated in a way. And so they can make a difference on that. But often it's not. I find on the policy side, you're right. There's they may engage, but they don't actually act, right? So it's not in the kind of parlance of some of the security or humanitarian. It's not about early warning. It's about early action. So we know, but we just don't act on it. On the science side, I do think there's a challenge that some scientists don't understand that the security community is interested in a wider range of dynamics and research and science, and so they don't think they have anything to say, and so they don't bother to engage. And so we've been doing some work with funding from the National Science Foundation to try to identify the practical barriers to doing that. I also don't think that at least in this country, traditional science funding mechanisms, the federal support for science that would be explicitly connected to this broad array of security questions for climate and environment, that's not what's funded, right? And that's not just about security. That's what's funded are really focused, disciplinary, specific, kind of, you have half the research done by the time you're getting that funding. And it's very kind of small c conservative in terms of methods that are adopted, right? And so in that side of things, I think the scientific community, whether it's the funders or science, or in many respects, the scientists who are serving on the review panel of all those proposals, it's incumbent on them to be much more methodologically plural, much more flexible in terms of understanding what's relevant, what's fundable, and what's important, that moves out of an exclusive focus on basic science that's intentionally not connected to some of these public policy questions, and is more inclusive. It's not to substitute it, but we need greater diversity in the kind of science, and particularly integrated or convergent science that is available to decision makers.
Thank you so much for that. I'd just like to ask you if you have any final remarks that you'd like to share with us before we wrap up.
No, well, of course, my apologies on the technology. I'm sure that was quite frustrating.
Not at all, not at all. It happens. I mean, it's
right. Yeah,
it can happen.
No, I mean, I think it's I'm very pleased that a group such as yours that's focused on the strategic is interested in engaging on the topic. I would urge you to try to find at kind of whatever level opportunity to engage with this wider lens that this is a clear example of, and not see it as an either or, but as something that could have bearing on your particular area of focus by geography or by topic, in part because I think one of our biggest challenges is understanding that the dynamics of climate change, and it's an umbrella for a number of changes, is something that is not going to be just the purview of those who do climate, but it's going to have impacts for all of us and all our portfolios, and those who figure out ways to understand what the threats and the opportunities presented by this and how it's going to change dynamics going forward will be those who are more effective in whatever area that they're choosing to engage on. And so see this as something that was that you find ways to integrate into your analysis and understanding of wherever you're choosing to spend your time and focus.
Massive thank you for speaking to us tonight, Professor, and for your insights and sharing your thoughts on this topic, which is very important and also pressing, of climate change and security. And as always, thank you to our members and viewers for your excellent questions. So if you enjoyed tonight and would like to join us next week, Tom Sear will be speaking to us about the intersection of climate policy, cyber policy and international relations. And also just a couple of notices. So as a reminder, if you're interested in joining the committee next term, or would like to find out more about it, just feel free to email any of the committee members. And also, please look out in the next couple of days for an email to sign up for Wargame in 6 weeks, which will be sent out soon. Thank you so much, and look forward to seeing you next time.
Great. Thanks much. Appreciate it. Take care.